Hello, I'm Jennifer Hall. Welcome to Inquiry. Not guilty by reason of necessity. The verdict in the Carleen Vanda Nelson trial took many by surprise and sparked debate across Ontario. The government is giving authorities sweeping new powers to fight terrorism. What's the balance between freedom and security? We have gathered a panel to hear their views on these and other issues making news these days. Joining me this evening are Megan Walker, the Executive Director of the London Abused Women's Centre, Robert Metz, President of the Freedom Party of Ontario, Gord Harris, News Director at Corus Entertainment London, and Greg Van Moorsel, Business Editor at the London Free Press. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you.
A lot of the water cooler talk in recent weeks has certainly been the verdict in the Carleen Vanda Nelson trial. The woman accused of abducting her 3 children and taking them across the border. Not guilty, the verdict. Her husband says it's going to be open season now for parents to abduct their children. Gord, what are you hearing from your viewers on this case?
Initially surprised. A lot of support for her. I think a woman going into that kind of situation has a lot of support sort of built in the community. Surprised at the verdict because the facts in the case appear to be clear. But as you dig deeper, people start to talk about the legal system and the way the legal system was used in this case. You know, that defense by reason of necessity, which many of us hadn't heard of before. So, you know, full credit to her great lawyer who found that loophole and drove a truck through it.
And no chance for appeal either.
That's right.
I think the idea of not guilty by reason of necessity is a very dangerous one. I would have said guilty by reason of necessity. I don't think necessity should be a basis for guilt or innocence. I think guilt or innocence should be determined on what you did or did not do. You can bring necessity or other arguments into the courtroom once you're in the sentencing stage for some kind of a situation, but certainly not in the determination of whether a crime was committed or not, because if you do that, we've just justified every single crime in the world. Your Honor, I robbed that bank because I needed the money. You know, Your Honor, I didn't fill out my tax return because I needed the money. You know, so it's a very dangerous precedent, and I think the issue here is not the particulars of the case, but what's going on in the court system and why they have to bend the rules so much to make things come out the way they want them to, really.
I don't think in this case they actually bent the rules. I think what they did was they found a loophole in the rules, and I think at some point somebody either needs to tighten up that loophole and make sure it doesn't exist in the future, or make sure that people understand why it exists as it stands. I think there is another issue that comes to the forefront, though, which is that the current family law system is inadequate and does not adequately meet the needs of children, and we have judges who continually talk about the best interests of children, and with all due respect, the majority of judges haven't actually parented a child in some 50 or more years as their children are all grown up, and for them to speak about the best interests of the child is something they can't appropriately do, given they don't have the background in doing that.
It's certainly something you can't do in an adversarial system.
And it is so adversarial. The family law system right now is so incredibly adversarial that people go into it speaking with each other, and by the end of the system, neither parent talks to each other anymore at all. And so that's, to me, a bigger issue than the loophole in the law.
Some people say that there's sexism at play here. If the roles had been reversed, if a father put his children in the trunk of a car and took them across a border and the cases were similar, would the verdict have been different?
Well, Jennifer, I talked to our court reporter, Jane Sims, about this story, and she raised a good point, and that is, you know, many people have been quick to leap to judgment about this case and whether it was right or whether it was wrong. None of those people sat in that courtroom and heard for a week or more what the court and the officers of the court heard. You know, and a jury acquitted this woman. I mean, she's entitled to an acquittal. I mean, that's a jury of her peers, a jury with more men on it than women. I think if it were a man, the pre-trial publicity would probably be nastier. But, you know, at some point you have to kind of put your faith in the system. That's what the system is for, and it was a jury, right? So.
All right, let's switch gears, shall we? Also making news this week, millions and millions more dollars, this time announced by Queen's Park, to make our home front secure. At what point do we say that's enough money or that's too much? And where is it coming from? Is everybody comfortable with the amount of money being spent? Are the perspectives in the right place?
We know where it's coming from. It's coming out of the taxpayer's pocket somewhere. But whether it's going to be money well spent is the issue. I don't think the police have any power really in the long term to protect us from anything. The police are generally a recursive instrument. You call them after you've been robbed, you've called them after a murder has been committed. They generally are not in the business of preventing crime, which is more and more the kind of talk they're getting into, and that's dangerous. When you get into that, you have to start worrying about being in a police state, because they want to stop people from being criminals before they even are. And how do you charge somebody under that circumstance? And that's going on right now. The Harris government's putting through Bill 30, which basically lets them confiscate your property, even if you've been found innocent, even if the charges against you are dropped, even if you don't go to court, they still get to keep your property. And that was legislation before September 11th. And now they're using it for supposedly terrorism.
There's another victim, I think, of one of these pendulum things where, you know, we're swinging now towards a very much law and order kind of society. I think what we'll see in the next couple of years is we'll swing that way, and then there'll be cries to pull it back the other way. The unfortunate thing to me in observing these things for many years is that we do these swings all the time. We're far right, we're far left, we're far right, you know, we do that, and there's never a middle ground. And I think you're right. I think there's a need to spend more time on security. I think it's something that's been ignored in this country, and we saw the evidence of that, and more evidence every day we're seeing of that. However, how far do you go, and what do you take that money from in order to fund that? And that's the really big issue. It's coming from taxpayers, yes, but it's also coming from other programs, other services. And where? What services are going to be cut? What agencies are going to be
Well, that assumes that the government's not willing to raise our taxes.
We're talking about...
They won't. They can't in Ontario without a referendum
They're
now.
talking about $10 million, right? That's what that's... The Ontario government spends like $75 billion a year. 10 million is not.
But let's be realistic. We can't continue to have a government that invests millions of dollars into new initiatives without having some outcomes. And you see, what concerns me about all of this is that if you're found to be guilty of any crime and you go through the criminal justice system, there's never any consequence to that crime. You know, I can go and rob a bank and I do 90 days in jail and then I'm sort of a free bird and can do whatever I like. I would much rather see the criminal justice system used as a deterrent to crime, as a consequence to crime, instead of somehow a justification of supporting a courthouse, which is what I believe it's all about now.
For more punishment?
We raise our children in society to be held accountable for the choices that they make, and there's a consequence to that choice, and yet we have a criminal justice system which says to people, you know, obey the law, and if you don't obey the law, there's going to be this consequence, and yet you go through the system, there's never any consequence. Nobody ever does hard time in Canada, and I have a real problem with that. We have pedophiles walking and roaming the streets in our neighborhood children's school areas. I have a real problem with that.
That's an entirely different area of concern than terrorism. I mean, what are you going to do to a terrorist who commits suicide by smashing himself into the side of a building? What's the adequate punishment for that?
An issue, and that's the danger now. We have to have laws that prevent crime. Robert, to your point, this is a different battle. This isn't about the bank robber that you chase after the fact. Once the fact is committed, it's too late. We've got to stop them before they can commit the crime. Well, and to do that, we have to have more police power than we have now. To do that costs more money.
I think the police have the power they need, actually. It's just that they're afraid to use it. I think we can give them that authority, but they must be held responsible when they make mistakes. And that's what we're seeing in legislation today. We're seeing legislation that specifically exempts the police from any responsibility in any cases of mistakes. And that's when you and I are in more danger from our own police than we are from terrorists.
Well, let's leave it there. When we come back, I want to talk more about the price of security and civil liberties. How far are we willing to go? Do stay with us on Inquiry. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Inquiry. Our governments can now eavesdrop on our lives in ways we have not seen in our lifetime. Is that a fair compromise with security being the ultimate goal, or is there a danger of Big Brother to having a little too much power here? Greg, your thoughts on this?
Well, you mean because of the fallout from the terrorist stuff?
Yes.
You know, I think it's reasonable that to expect a lot more security. It's reasonable to expect a lot more questions about what you're doing and where you're going and what you're up to. I mean, let's face it, if you're up to nothing nefarious, then it's not a problem, right? I think we also need to know what powers and what abilities authorities have. I don't think these ought to be secretive kinds of powers. And I think some of the comparisons that have been drawn between, for example, the treatment of Japanese in the Second World War are just entirely off the mark. I mean, completely different. I mean,
they coming from the Muslim community, though, they say this is our fear.
No, but think about this. They rounded up thousands of people, packed them onto cattle cars, and whisked them off into remote, desolate parts of the country to live in what were basically our versions of internment camps.
I think a better analogy.
It's not at all the same.
Yeah, I think a better analogy now is what happened in Quebec in the October crisis of 1970. When War Measures Act was put in, I happened to live in Quebec at the time. We were pleased to see that happen because we were afraid. We had mailboxes exploding. We had cabinet ministers being kidnapped. We didn't know. We lost our sense of security, small s, and that has happened here. I think, you know, the laws are community standards. We have these new laws, Bill C-36, which is going to come in. How the police use that law, how far they go with it, that's going to determine the community standards. At some point, the community right now is saying, we want this because we want to feel safer. At some point, the community will say, wait a minute, that's going too far. And I think, like we talked earlier about family law, it evolves and it grows and develops and shrinks, and we're going to see this change in the next couple of years.
Is it dangerous to not have a sunset clause? This is an indefinite measure right now.
No, there should be a sunset clause. Definitely a sunset clause. It's a sense of security right now, but it has to come to an end. You can always extend the sunset clause, but to have it there in perpetuity is
the issue too is I think you have to always assume that any time you're on any electronic instrument, whether it's your telephone or whether you're on the internet or on cable, that's not really private unless you want to pay extra to buy that privacy. So actually that's a separate issue. If you want to be private, you can. And quite frankly, I don't see how all this extra security measures are going to stop people if they know that this is going on. They're not going to be making their plans on the phone. They're not going to, you know, be saying we're going to put that bomb on the bridge on such and such over something that can be monitored. They're going to do what they're doing over in the Mideast, hand deliver messages, and you know, it's going to come down to man-on-man spying if you really want to be effective.
Well,
electronic surveillance.
That costs a lot of money.
Well, if you want to do it, you should do it.
That's right. But then we're back to the money argument as to how much is Canada willing to spend. What are we prepared to give up in terms of social programs, in terms of health care? Is it not going to get the money that everyone says it needs in order to fight terrorism? Many people say you don't have anything else unless you have a sense of security. Yeah. You have to have that as the basis of your society. That's been undermined, and that issue has to be settled quickly.
I think the difference is, like, this is almost like you know, not a war of choice, but a war of necessity. Yeah. You know, you can choose to go to war against this dictator and that despot and, you know, this country. This one, there's no choice. It's come here, right? Or it could come here, and that's enough. And you have to respond. You know, the costs and the security concerns or the privacy concerns are one thing, but I think too there will be an expectation that the public will be a line of defense in a way that they never have before. Yes. I think, for example, you know, we're not sitting in an elementary school, but at some point, you would think kids would be discussing with their teachers. They may be a generation that grows up now with the kind of you know, suspicious eyes and ears of that we never had. Like, you see something odd, you report it, you know, and they will think nothing of it, perhaps.
Assuming the public mood is completely on side right now with the money and attention being spent on security, what does this mean for charities here at home that are now perhaps being left behind because money is being channeled into a victim relief fund for another country?
Yeah, I think the entire September 11th incident has left a lot of charities with fewer resources. I know at the London Abused Women's Centre, we normally do our direct mail campaign starting September 15th. Obviously, we put that on hold and have just started it now. So now we're not only competing with the United Way and everybody else in the City of London that's raising money at this time, but we're also competing continually with what's going on September 11th. And so whether it be a direct contribution to the Red Cross or whomever people choose to give, or an increase in our taxes to, you know, pay for all of these new initiatives, people will have fewer resources in their pocket to actually give, and that will definitely have an impact on what goes on in my business. And I find that really troubling. You know, it's interesting to me, one of the reports from the United Nations stated that 6,000 children a day die in the United States from either health-related issues or poverty. And yet nobody ever invests hundreds of millions of dollars into eliminating child poverty. But here we have a situation where it was a horrendous situation, obviously, and 6,000 people died. And we've now, the whole entire country, the whole continent, the whole world is pulling money out from nowhere.
You can't spend money to alleviate poverty. You can spend $100 million, but you're still going to have poverty at the end of it. Poverty is not an object that you can purchase or get rid of by throwing money at it. Poverty is a social condition.
Is this part of therapy then? People are trying to heal by feeling that they're making a difference and donating?
I run an organization that works totally on volunteer contributions. And I can tell you on September 11th, our mail pattern changed completely. It just stopped. And I think that's both a good and a bad thing. On the one hand, you can see how affected people are by what happened in New York on September 11th, and supposedly they're going to follow through with that, and the money used for that can be used for things to respond to what happened on that day, and I think it should be.
think the other thing people are worried about now in terms of making donations is their own economic future. You're competing not only with the United Way, but also with the economic news on a daily basis. Our dollar is at the lowest point ever this week. We've had layoffs, big layoffs in major industries, many more to come. And you know, there's an insecurity financially as well, which is going to hurt donations. But the other thing is, I think it's different fighting poverty and fighting terrorism, because there's a psyche out there that I'm never going to be poor. So I'm not going to go out of my way to fight that problem. But I could be an innocent person in a World Trade Center, and a terrorist could get me. I fly. I could be. So there's a lot of self-preservation in terms of the willingness to spend money on security.
I think the other thing, too, is that, which in some ways drives the donations, or has driven it, I think, is this was a global media event. Everybody watched it, you know, ad nauseum. Yeah. It was on and on and on. And there are very few, like, you know, even in our lifetimes, there have been very few of these kinds of global media events that cry out for some kind of response. You know, the only one I was trying to think about this on my way over here, and the only one I can think of is the Ethiopian famine. When the depth of the Ethiopian famine became clear in the early 1980s, I mean, it just spawned a whole series of unusual fundraising things. Fairly arrogant and sometimes quite selfish rock stars getting together to do live aid concerts and things like that. I mean, it just kind of morphed into an unexpected direction, and I think that's
you touched on an interesting point, the role of the media. We'll take a quick break here, Gordon. When we come back, I'd like to talk about your thoughts on how the media has handled September 11th. Stay with us. Welcome back to Inquiry. Talking about the role of the media since September 11th, particularly I'm thinking about the anthrax stories. And at what point does the media have to back off and stop reporting them, or is it our role? Let's start with some of the non-media people in the crowd. Your reaction to the coverage?
I think it's a little overdone, but I don't blame the media for doing it. I think what you have to count on is a more intelligent audience that understands the information it's getting and understands the whole situation in perspective. If you're actually looking at I mean, it would be irresponsible to the media not to report it. Let's put it that way. And so I, as a viewer, have to decide, is this information valuable to me? Are they giving me the proper context? They're giving us the right numbers. They're telling us how many people it's affecting. And basically, percentage-wise, it's 0.000 something. And there are many worse things going on. Like, for example, in Florida, during this whole crisis, there were some major hurricanes that struck the state of Florida and would have been front-page news and all over the place that just never got anybody's attention. And you wonder who's helping those people, who's sending money and giving help to the situation that was going down there. Had to be just about as bad as what happened in New York if you look at some of the damage, but we're not as afraid of it because it's not human beings doing that.
Well, the other thing is it's happened before. You know, anytime you become desensitized to hurricanes or earthquakes, but terrorism and bombs, planes crashing into buildings, it's like something you read in a comic book when you're a kid. You don't actually ever expect those things to happen. So I agree.
In the countries where it does, you're right, they do become desensitized.
Exactly. You know, it's like when you look at the pictures now of Afghanistan, you see citizens just going about their daily business. And my children, they say to me all the time, how can you live there and just go about your business? Wouldn't you be so afraid? Well, this is a country that's been in war for so long. How are you possibly afraid? You just expect it. It's the norm.
Has there been enough room for questioning dissent in the media? Has there been enough of that in terms of the measures being taken since September 11th? Or is it still such a hot topic that it's too unpopular to question?
I think it's becoming more so. I think in the early days it was you would be stoned if you questioned American foreign policy. And we had some people doing that, and there were some columnists in the United States who did that and were fired, and it was atrocious. I mean, the media really took a hit for this thing. But I think now more and more people are starting to look at the other side. It's been a very difficult story for the media to handle. I won't speak for Greg, but I know in my case, I was on the air when it was happening. You lost all sense of security. Every 2 minutes there was another major American building being evacuated. It was kind of, what the heck is going on? You know, and you're trying to maintain calm. It was a very difficult situation. Then as the story developed and progressed, the anthrax thing, Robert, thanks for the support, because that was a difficult one too. You have to report it. We're not censors. Didn't get into this business to be a censor, and yet I have to put it in perspective. So when I have 17 victims, I've got to make sure people realize it's 17 victims. No cases reported in Canada. You know, if there's a white powder on the laundry room floor, it's probably tied.
We've got about 3 minutes left, and Greg, I'd like to pick up with you, and we're going to switch gears again to provincial politics, if you don't mind. Because I do want to touch on Mike Harris's departure, something we haven't talked about yet on Inquiry, and certainly the speculation is heating up as to successors, that kind of thing. Is this the end of the common sense revolution, do you think?
Well, you know, the common sense revolution was a platform written for one election in 1995. Right? Some of the same ideology filtered through, and this is a continual thread. It went to through the 99 platform as well. You know, a new leader will morph the party into a new direction. That has been the Conservative, for the nearly half century that the Conservatives were in power in Ontario in an unbroken fashion. That was the way they reinvented themselves. It was the same party, new leader, reinvent the party by getting a new leader. So you'll see some twists and you'll see some change, but I mean, I think fundamentally it's going to remain a Conservative government.
It's interesting because
party.
Even if a more moderate leader is chosen, there's been so much damage done over the past 5 years. Like I look at healthcare, for instance, where surgeons on a regular basis were being told that they weren't able to operate the next day because there weren't enough staff to work in the operating rooms. Many of those surgeons have left the country.
Well, you know,
even if there was a
same kind of things were happening
even if there was a huge influx
Bob Ray and David Peterson.
Like you know, the healthcare. You know, let's just get into it. I mean, people are going to jump on the hot button definition issues, healthcare, education. You know, in the late 80s, Ontario was building hospitals it couldn't afford to run. Right. You know, you need a new hospital wing in your small town? Absolutely. There's $3 million. Can't afford to run it though.
Yep, political purpose.
All over the place. Now we have the ratcheting back, although ironically, this government has spent more on healthcare, far more than any other government.
Yeah.
You know, these things are not, you know, they're not easy.
And
to
that's
just
what people don't understand.
in
How
that
can
way.
you spend more money on something and get less service? But that's a government reality.
Yeah.
How does the new leader maintain the Tories' support and yet also backtrack and apologize and fix some of these complaints they're hearing?
There won't be an
There'll be
apology.
no
Not at all.
backtracking, there'll be no apologizing, and bank on it, they're going to win. They're going to win again.
I don't.
This is a very...
So sure about that.
Predictions
No, I
from
think
everybody?
they will. No, I think the Tories will be reelected because it's the opposition has targeted not the official opposition but the unofficial opposition, the labor unions, the teachers unions, Mike Harris and the Harris government. There is no Mike Harris, there is no Harris government. Now it's a Flaherty government or whatever. It's a whole new face, and they can come back again. The Liberals are always leading in this province 2 years before an election, and they don't win.
Exactly.
So the Tories will be back.
I believe it'll be a liberal government. I can't imagine that the Tories will be they have.
Liberal governments...
Everybody said that 2 years ago.
I know, but
Listen, liberal governments in this province are a peculiar anomaly. They almost never happen. I mean, I think we could say with great certainty it will not be an NDP government. Probably we will never see one of those in our lifetime, is my guess, again, in Ontario. But you know, when you think, this is my way of thinking about it. What is it that you would think of right now, a voter, if you thought of a Liberal government? One thing. Think of one thing. And most voters couldn't come up with one thing, because the Liberals haven't done anything to define themselves.
And the danger, again, is if we get into an election where we vote against somebody rather than for somebody, that's a dangerous thing.
And exactly, but that is what we do in this province,
Yes,
in
we
this
do
country.
federally as
And you
well.
talk about
Right.
the pendulum swinging too far. That's how we vote here. Oh, I hate them. I'm going to vote for this.
You know, whether you like them or not, though, I mean, the progressive Conservatives under Mike Harris have done, well, they've certainly lasted. You know, remember, this was a party that was moribund and it was on its deathbed whenever he took it over. They are extremely successful. They're successful at raising money. They're successful at dodging issues.
And I look at Walkerton, for instance. His success and the success of that party has come at the expense of real people in real communities. And I don't think the regular voters will forget that.
As the race heats up, this discussion will also heat up, and we'll bring you all back to talk about that as the leadership draws closer. Thank you to everybody. It's been a very interesting chat today, and thanks for joining us on Inquiry. Have a good weekend.